Disclaimer, I played Ghostwire Tokyo on the Xbox Series X and will talk about it in the context of me doing so. Any performance or glitch type issues may differ from others. I will try and indicate when I talk about spoilers, but beware, footage may be considered spoiler heavy. Also, just as I mentioned, I played Ghostwire Tokyo in the Japanese dub. Ghostwire Tokyo can be described as a first-person action and adventure game with horror elements due to the nature of Tango Gameworks, the studio who created it, who also worked on games such as The Evil Within and The Evil Within 2. Starting with the story, it takes place in, as the name suggests, Tokyo, specifically in Shibuya. You play as Akito, a young man who's possessed by a spirit called KK, who found him after an event which left him knocked out in his car before an ominous fog rolls in. Over the course of the game, KK and Akito start to get sort of a bond or friendship as they rely and help each other. It starts when they're left with no choice but to work together. They start to become more fond of each other. This is shown multiple times throughout the game where it becomes separated, and the gameplay and power fantasy of Akito is much different than when you have a KK where you can use your powers. You have to rely more on stealth or just kind of escape. The man in the Hanya mask, just referred to as Hanya, is the primary antagonist of the story. Both Akito and KK have reasons to stop him, apart from him being the reason for summoning the visitors in the first place. There's 6 chapters to the game, first being quite short, second being longer, and third and fourth chapters is where the game starts to open up the most. 5 and 6 are past the point of no return, thus you'll be locked out of the rest of the world until they are completed. Moving on from the general story and more to the core themes that I interpreted, a key theme that is presented throughout this game is the theme of loss, losing your family, being alone, and most importantly, learning to move on past that and not clinging to the past. Bit of spoilers here. Both protagonist and the antagonist are really chasing similar things. Akito wants his sister back. Hanya's wife passed away and he sacrificed his daughter to fulfill his plans, which fundamentally is linked to this theme. He wants to link the world of the living and the afterlife, and has proven he would do anything to see this through. Some of his dialogue, and particularly some of the delivery or how he speaks and what he actually says, is interesting as well. He has a coping mechanism or justification. No matter who dies in the end, they'll end up in the afterlife and they'll be able to come back when his plans are fulfilled. Here's a major spoiler here. There is just one ending, and I'll be real, it hit me very personally, and this is where, you know, the theme of loss really became present and obvious. Hanya goes to another dimension. Akito has to say goodbye to his sister he's been trying to save for the whole game, and he meets his parents in the afterlife where they take Mari with them and leave Akito alone. KK also at this point has to move on because there's nothing keeping him here after Hanya's defeated. He tells KK to tell his wife and son that he never gave up. In terms of the actual story being told, not in the way it's told in terms of mission or story structure, especially the ending, I really found it one of the strongest, or like one of the best parts of the game. Taking place in the heart of Shibuya, we see a beautiful representation of the Japanese style, culture and folklore. Correct me if I'm wrong, since I've never been to Japan, but the way the world is crafted in terms of its visuals, the sheer density of the local area in terms of what is conveyed to the player is an achievement on itself. That core Japanese aesthetic really does carry the game, and it does help that the graphical quality of the assets is absolutely stunning as well. Now this is where Ghostwire Tokyo kind of gets decisive. I'll get into the nitty gritty in some upcoming sections, but the main issues that plague Ghostwire Tokyo is at instances, which is very unfortunate because there's a lot of potential that is squandered in repetitive story missions, which just consist of cleansing more and more Torii gate, that dry Ubisoft-like open world design which has plagued AAA Western games for years at this point, a very limited combat system which shows a lot of promise but ended up being very weak in the end, in my opinion. I'll be honest, when I first sat down last July to play Ghostwire Tokyo, what made me initially drop the game was the spirit counter on the map that really put me off. As someone who likes open worlds but not the monotonous, grindy fetch quest kind of ones that seem to be majority nowadays, the fact is that while you don't need to get 100% or anything close to that of the spirit counter, the spirit collecting and turn-in is where I found the most XP in the game. Depending on how many I turned in, like I would get a level which allowed me to get more skill points to spend, and I have to say some of the perks in the perk tree as well are just not really impactful, just stat increase or like percentage increases that don't really affect the actual power fantasy. I really feel the best thing Tango could have done for this game, and perhaps the best thing they could do in a potential sequel, is really focus on those highlights and cut down the filler, really focus in and add greater depth to the game, widening the power fantasy, equally focusing on the horror aspects. While I get to the horror elements later, I'll say right now that DLC or like the update mission that they had is exactly in the direction that I think the rest of the game should have been going into. Even if the way they do this is by cutting some of the openness or open world feeling, focus on like a linear experience to begin with. Now I've spoken a bit about combat, but I'll get into more of why I feel how I do in this section. First of all, combat, if you haven't been paying attention to the footage, is akin to first-person shooters, but instead of shooting guns, shooting different elements of magic. Combat at first feels good, but if you go off the main story and start doing side stuff like I did, which doesn't unlock your next spell, it's pretty easy to get bored of spamming the same thing again and again and again. You have wind, fire, and water in terms of spells, fire being the strongest, but of course having less charges, starting with 5 at max. Wind is meant to be the fastest, and water is also strong but it has a very short range. All of these spells can be held down later to do ethereal weaving if you unlock the perk to do so. The wind ethereal weaving shoots multiple wind blasts at once, starting with 3. Fire ethereal weaving does a large explosion which does high damage, and the water ethereal weaving is a water slashing like attack. Different skills allow you to increase the amount of wind blasts your ethereal weaving wind does. They can increase your radius of your fire ethereal weaving, and they can also increase the water slash's range. There's a even more in-depth kind of overclocked spells, which when ethereal weaving is charged, if you hit the right stick, wind does a spread shot, almost automatic firing mode. This was my favorite of like the overclocked element. I think it's called elemental something spells. Fire switches to more of a flamethrower, which needs to be held down, and water had this ice type barrier which freezes surrounding enemies. Overall, as stated, the second and third ones really didn't interest me as a player, and when trying to use them, it would usually get me into more trouble than just using their base counterparts. However, that was just my experience of them. Others may just have a different style of gameplay. Around the mid to late game, you also get the ability to wire in, which is basically Akito and KK going in perfect sync. And this is great in terms of power fantasy. A large shockwave is sent out, which damages enemies greatly, exposes their cores. SP, which is basically like ammo, is automatically recharged, and the player is allowed to go crazy with attacks for a limited time. In terms of the general combat, you can block, dodge, perfect block, which leads to them countering, can ground pound, and you can quick purge, which can pick enemies off pretty quickly. So far there's a part I've neglected to talk about, and that's the weaponry in the game. I really disliked how they used the bow, and I usually never used it given the option. I tried to like it, but it's really underpowered, underutilized for what it could be. It's definitely the weakest aspect in terms of combat. There are different talismans in the games which have different side effects, such as stunning enemies in a force field like electricity, a decoy talisman and exposure talisman which is really good for large crowds of enemies. There's also updraft and spirit talismans, both of which I really didn't use too much, because in general, for my personal playstyle, the only talisman I really liked was the stun electricity like a talisman. The others, like the ones focused on stealth, would be good for people who like that kind of methodical stealth like gameplay. In my opinion, they just weren't for me, so they weren't used. Now if you remember, I said the combat could use more depth or was weak in certain parts. The weaponry is a big part of that, but I think there's a wider issue. I'd like it so that when it comes to spells, there were more of them, or at least in some way there was some other way to use them in ways like other than their base functions. Maybe if you could have like some sort of hybrid spell, or like wind fire blasts, or like water and fire to create steam to confuse enemies, or wind and water make like ice weapon like ice blades or ice slashes. This is just spitballing ideas. I hope my point comes across. There's more ideas and more things that could be done with the combat to like keep it fresh and have players specialize in each playstyle they want to play in, adding more versatility and depth to existing abilities in this way, or perhaps adding new ones, would be a good start in my opinion, and also adding some more use cases for the bow. Maybe adding the same versatility for spells. Maybe there would be like a rapid shot for the bow, or elemental effect, like how does it, there's different talismans, maybe you could have different arrows. It's just me thinking off the top of my head as well. So now moving on to enemy variety and design. This is a very strong point of the game. A lot of the enemies you find in the beginning are kind of the same 2-3 type, but later on as the game opens up you find more and more variety, and a lot more enemy types were introduced. As for the enemy mechanics, there isn't directly too many reskinned enemies. There were similar enemies, but they had different, like slightly altered attack patterns. The different enemies previously stated obviously are based on Japanese folklore and urban legends, I believe. Each enemy, in my opinion, fits their specific role in the roster. There are big mini-boss like enemies which stand to act as a challenge for the player. There are enemies which swarm around the player but are usually weak on their own, and there's enemies that summon more enemies, etc. Now, talking about bosses, there's only a few bosses in Ghostwire Tokyo, which is a shame because the bosses that were part of the story were genuinely enjoyable, apart from maybe 1 or 2. From bosses that chase you and you have to sneak up behind them, to bosses that take up an arena and confront the player. I do have some criticism though that the actual arenas aren't that unique. I would have liked to see more variety, so I would have liked Tango to include some of those visual effects they'd use for some of the side missions and have the boss arena change or contort over time. I didn't like also how some of them were kind of easy. They could have added some more unique mechanics to spice things up from time to time. When it comes to mini bosses in the game, as a part of side content, they're basically just a normal boss. They're just with a bit of a story, and some of what I was talking about, like in the Lady in Red side quest, where it's built up beforehand and they use a lot of that visual contortion and visual horror effect that I was talking about previously. Or none of the mini bosses had actually any unique mechanics about them. Make no mistake, this is the weakest point of Ghostwire Tokyo so far. While the world itself is beautifully crafted, it's staggeringly static in what you can do. You can hardly interact with anything in the world. The vast majority of buildings have no way to enter them. Just staircases that literally you cannot walk up, but you can see and like you can halfway walk near. It feels like this open world was tacked on after, because the world opens up in a very deliberate way. The actual progression of the game's open world is very linear, because you're constrained to where the fog is, and it forces the player to stay in those districts that are not liberated. Dry map marker driven design makes this so much worse as well. The statues are needed to get extra SP for certain magic are scattered around or about, and are probably the only things that aren't directly marked on the map at first. I didn't really like looking for these and I didn't find them all. It just sucks that something directly connected to your power is the only thing not shown on the map. They could have done better by having like challenges or something to increase your SP instead of these statues. The repetitiveness of the open world really is the main issue. The side content outside of specific side missions are poor quality or non-existent. It would have been nice to have a lively, bustling nighttime Shibuya with a bunch of people around and activities to do. And then slowly over the course of the game, more and more people will disappear until nearing the end it's like how it is at the beginning of Ghostwire Tokyo 1. Just a suggestion or insight, but that's just my opinion as well. There were different types of side quests, but some of the earlier ones in my opinion were the better ones in quality. The more repetitive ones like the clearing or cleansing the cherry blossom trees, the yokai side quests were decent, but because it was good to see each one had a different method with dealing with them. Some were just, hiding, some ran away, some gave you their power willingly after helping them out. That variety was nice. A bit torn on these missions being added to just the, open world's pool of fetch quests. They were cool the first time, but then it just becomes repetitive afterwards. There's also fetch quests, type missions, and these were pretty meh overall. The ones that take you into a more detective-like role, looking around an area to find an evil spirit to destroy, were pretty good and had a good atmosphere. In my opinion, this is what they should have really focused on in the game. Tackling what side quests you should do. What I will say is, if a mission has a unique icon, it's something you should go do. There's 2 pretty good side missions that are near the end of the game, which I recommend anyone doing. The one set in the school is a highlight in terms of horror, mission design, and uniqueness. It honestly shows what the game could have been. Speaking of horror, let's move on to the horror aspects of the game. Now, will Ghostwire Tokyo scare you? That's up to you. or is subjective, and it's something that didn't scare me could very well make something unplayable for you, and vice versa. Now, did Ghostwire Tokyo generally scare me? No single exception of the mission I was just talking about before. Ghostwire Tokyo didn't scare me, at most creep me out. It was more of a spooky game more than a horror game. Now, let's move on to why that could be. The biggest reason why it isn't scary is the power fantasy. You're meant to be fighting back against these paranormal beings, and it isn't really hard out, so that this leads you to not feeling threatened on the level that you would feel scared. A lot of the enemies aren't really that scary either in terms of design. There's a few nasty looking ones, or like more likely just faceless or headless enemies. That stuff doesn't really scare me personally at all. The reason I say power fantasy a lot here is the only thing that scared me was something that you couldn't get rid of or kill. You had to deal with it in a certain way. The atmosphere and the tension in some missions might get people scared. They got me more excited than scared at all. As I said before, if Tango were set on making a sequel for this game, that school mission could be the baseline in mission design, as it is of decent length, kept me engaged, kept me in suspense, and created a situation where I did get startled a few times. The music was amazing throughout, set the tone for what was going on, and in general really had that Japanese flair. Cannot understate how good this aspect is. Just listen to the soundtrack. The sound design was also great. One thing that horror games usually get wrong is when to drum up the music, when to intensify, and knowing when to use horror's greatest tool, silence. The footsteps of the player's opening doors, no music. That builds such good atmosphere and really adds to intensity than some music ever could. Then there's knowing when to use a lower pitch sound to drum up the intensity when a climactic moment is near. I played the game in Japanese, so I can't speak on the English dub. The Japanese dub, in my experience, was very good. I'd say 20 to 24 hours in Ghostwire Tokyo in terms of playtime. I did nearly all the actual substantial side content in terms of side quests. The only thing I really didn't touch was the Spider's Thread mode, which was like a roguelike 30 level mode, which was added later. I'd say you could have a good 33 hours of gameplay here if you wanted to complete this game more than I did. If you wanted to find all the spirits for some reason, would I recommend you buy Ghostwire Tokyo? Probably not at its full price, I'll be real. Ghostwire Tokyo is on Game Pass right now, and so I think if you really wanted to play the game, try it out for a bit. See if it's your style. Maybe if it is your style of game, then purchase it at full price or when it's on sale. As per usual, Ghostwire Tokyo isn't as part of a franchise yet, so I can't give it a numbered score. Here's my overall pros and cons. Exceptional sound and music, stunning graphics and art style, excellent rendition of Shibuya from what I understand, decent combat. School update mission was more of what I wanted to see, and great atmosphere. Cons: lackluster side quest design, bad open world reminiscent of previously bad open worlds, and didn't find it all that scary. Thank you for watching this video. See you in the next review. If you enjoyed, like and subscribe, really helps the channel out.